I'm Josh Scott. Today we're hanging out with Jim Ruland. We're going to be talking about your lifelong work as both a writer, editor, kind of documentarian of punk culture in general. So, to kind of start us off today, Jim, would you mind kind of giving me what's your definition of punk? Do you see different between like punk rock the music or like punk the culture, and kind of like what your thoughts are on that?
Wow, well, to use a very 21st century word, I'd say punk rock is a mindset or attitude, a vibe. It's not so much a style of music, which was how I related to the term for a good part of my 20s and 30s. But once I started learning more about the history of punk rock, it applied to so many more things than just music.
Um, Building on that, um, could you share about how did you get into writing about and kind of documenting the culture as a whole?
Sure. I guess it would start really with the first show. My first punk rock show was the Ramones at the Wax Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1984. I was 16 years old. My mom brought me and my brother to the show. So that was kind of my baptism. But I came from a very strict military family, and I did not shave my head and start breaking bottles. I was very much a rule follower. I went to Catholic school. Rebellion and smash the state was not really in my vocabulary. I just thought I was a weird kid who liked weird music. And I was a terrible student, so I ended up in the Navy. And it's really in the Navy where I got my punk rock education, where I learned about different kinds of music because my shipmates were punk rockers and skinheads and thrashers and metalheads and people who were into hip hop and former DJs and all kinds of things. But now here I am on a ship with all this stimulation, but no way to really listen to any of this music. So I had to rely on other people and become a seeker. I had to seek it out on my own because it's not like the Armed Forces Radio was going to say, here you go, Jim, here's a playlist for you. I don't know if there were playlists in the 80s.
There were, but not like the ones that we kind of understand nowadays with these streaming platforms.
Right. So that I would say it was always a late bloomer because I didn't figure out that I wanted to go to college until about 10 seconds into boot camp. And once I did, I met up with some people who were interested in writing for zines. And when that happened, they started to send me CDs and tapes and things to review. And that got me started. That got me, giving me, now I had access to this thing that I just used to read about on the back of tapes and CDs. And that was pretty thrilling.
You kind of touched on it a little bit when I was researching you. I kind of came across some other stuff. And so your parents lived here in San Diego, and that was leading up to when your dad left for Vietnam?
Right. That was very, very briefly. My dad was getting ready for Vietnam, and he was in swift boats, so he was doing his training out at North Island, and my parents had a little place in Imperial Beach, and that's where I was conceived, which wasn't planned because they were both New Yorkers, and as soon as my mom got pregnant with me, she was like, I'm going back to New York. I'm not going to be out here on my own trying to have a baby and raise a kid.
No, I get it. And then you were in the Navy yourself.
Yep.
But then when you finished your tour, you kind of hung out here in San Diego, if I understand right?
Not right away.
Okay.
I was one of those, squids that was a good sailor on the boat, but just an absolute menace on the beach. The kind that you see at the gas lamp, and you're like, oh, that poor SOB. and or even worse down in TJ making and so I was really looking forward to getting out of the Navy and getting out and away from San Diego as far as possible. I grew up in Virginia, so wherever you sign up, that's where the Navy will send you back, and it's also like where your residence is. So even after all these experiences in California, I was a Virginia resident, and that's where I could afford to go to college. So I went back to Virginia for school, and immediately came back to California.
So how, as a former sailor, you've gone to college, you've kind of headed back to San Diego. Where did the writing come from? Is that what you specialized in college?
Mostly as English, my relationship to writing was always full of doubt. Like I didn't think it was something I could do. I loved to read. I loved, all kinds of escapist literature and fantasy. I really didn't start reading actual literature until I was in literature with a capital L, until I was in the Navy, because I would just read anything I could get my hands on. If you get in a lot of trouble, it's called, you get restricted to the ship, restricted liberty. So I had a lot of free time on my hands where I wasn't allowed to hit the beach. So I read everything from Stephen King to Jack Kerouac to I read In Cold Blood, when I was somewhere in Japan, I think. And that all had a big effect on me. But being that kind of person is not really good for your self-esteem. And when I did get to college, I didn't really think I was cut out for anything. And I started writing about my Navy experiences in my freshman essay class. And my teacher was like, Jim, this is really good. You should keep doing this. And it was probably the first time I had heard I was good at something other than getting in trouble in a couple of years. So
Yeah.
I gravitated right to, I was like, tell me more. Tell me, how do I be better? And so I was at that professor's office hours every week.
You've written several books. I know you as author of Corporate Rock Sucks. This is kind of where you and I you first connected. But that night you were emceeing for another author.
That's right.
I found that really kind of like a fun experience. At least it seemed like you were enjoying it a lot, being able to like kind of help promote and share the stories of another author. But when we talked about what we could talk about here, you actually brought up that you wanted to talk about zines instead and DIY culture.
That's right.
That you were kind of like, I've done the book tour. I don't want to really talk about that. I got one question for you. So I come from a graphic design background, and like this is what I know as like a zine is like you take one piece of paper and you kind of cut it and fold it, and it's a great way to get information out. But this is like what we do as like artist students. But then you brought in a copy of Razorcake, and this is not what like me as a student would call a zine. So could you help kind of explain to me and everyone else watching, like what is that difference between a zine and a more like larger publication?
Sure. A zine is just short for a magazine, but what it means is a self-published magazine.
Oh, okay.
Lately, you'll see corporations getting involved, with a zine, film studios having zines, and some are pretty slick, and that's cool and everything. But it's basically anything that's, independently published or self-produced. In the punk rock world, there usually are collaborative efforts. It'll be one person with an idea, but realize, wow, like I need to collaborate with bands. I need photos. I need artwork. I need, just like everyone in punk rock discovers, it's more than just plugging in your guitar and making some noise in front of some screaming people. You need people to document the scene. You need people to record you and put out your records. You need artists, photographers, people who are handy with gear and equipment. You need a van. So communities spring up out of all this stuff, and it's the same way with zines. In punk rock, uh, the initial impulse was they were fanzines, and they were created by fans of the music. And why is that? It's because punk rock wasn't being covered anywhere else. You might be able to read about New York bands in places like the Village Voice, where people you could subscribe to anywhere in the U.S. back then when we had a thriving newspaper economy. And zines would crop up in local scenes to start supporting, the music that people love. A lot of times a kid would listen to a band and they'd be like, wow, this is the best thing I've ever heard. And then they go to their record store and they'd be like, yeah, we don't carry that crap. And so you would have to find other people who like that music too. And that led a lot of people to starting their own fanzines and interviewing these bands. And that became a way for the music to spread rather than the musicians themselves handing out tapes. So that's where the punk rock zine stuff comes from. Like there in the 90s, there was a huge wave of zines that came out of the Riot Grrrl movement, feminist zines, and that's really never stopped. Every few years, people rediscover zines, and you'll have a wave of, body positivity zines, zines about vaccines, zines about whatever people feel like is not being talked about in culture, or what people are getting wrong, or what people are missing out on, or what an individual artist might have to say. And you've made zines, I make zines. Yours are probably much prettier looking with your graphic design. The zines I've made are mostly just type. They're stories I've written with a couple of, awkward cut and paste.
So how did you get connected with Razorcake?
So the guy I went to school with was, I was out in school in Arizona, and his ambition was to write for Flipside Fanzine. Flipside was one of the original LA fanzines started by Al Flipside in 1977. I think the first issue was a bunch of kids sitting around listening to the first Cheap Trick record and reviewing it, and typing out what they recorded.
Yeah.
But around that time was a real explosive punk rock scene in LA, and Flipside became a really big and important part of documenting that. And they were somewhat consistent. They lasted throughout the 80s and into the 90s, which is when I got involved with it in that really confusing time after Nirvana and after the mainstreaming of punk rock, and people were like, well, what is punk now?
Right.
Which seems kind of quaint here in 2026, right? Yeah.
Definitely. So zines, you've been mentioning how they've always kind of been central to punk culture in general and sharing the news. Why are zines important to you personally?
Well, it kind of mirrored zines, and my relation to them mirrored my, ambitions in a lot of ways. Like I wanted to be a writer, and unlike my friend Todd Taylor, who went off to write for Flipside and then started Razorcake with our mutual friend Sean Carswell, people who are still really close friends of mine to this day. We all had other ambitions besides to write about punk rock and to write. It was just the music that we loved. And after Flipside went away, there was like a real hole there. And so I had an opportunity when I moved back to LA to interview bands and to talk to these people. And so access is really the thing that got me most excited, because now I'm sitting in a van or in a green room with these bands, drinking their beer and asking them questions and having a good time, and then running around in the pit afterwards and trying to hopefully remember everything that they told me, that if I lose a tape or forgot to turn it on or all that kind of stuff. And And it sounds like, wow, you were a pretty terrible, zine writer, and I really was. I was definitely more interested in the partying, the lifestyle, and all of that. But when my friends started Razorcake, I was like, I need to step up my game, and not surprisingly, my writing improved, and I got better at doing interviews. I got better at writing record reviews. I had things to say about bands, the culture, things happening in the world, and I got to write about all those things in a column that I turned in on time, and that I cared about how it looked and how it sounded. So it was once that I made that leap, is then I started having other opportunities to write professionally for other magazines.
We kind of touched on it in the beginning about the zines with larger companies. I'm wondering if you have thoughts or opinions on, is the point of a zine to stay small, or like, can it grow into something larger? Like, can it become a larger publication while still like holding on to its core values? Or at some point, does it just become like an advertising machine? Like, what do you think?
That is a great question, and I think it's a question that everybody that starts a zine or a publishing concern or a record label or gets into making films or all those things have to answer for themselves. In the 90s, I was thinking, well, this could be cool, like writing for Flipside. It might lead somewhere, which is a terrible reason to do anything. I committed to it because I was passionate about it, and I stopped caring about where it might go. Now, Corporate Rock Sucks, the book I wrote about SST Records, is kind of a case study in this question you're asking about how this label went from being a very DIY outfit with an outstanding mail order operation, which catapulted the label into success and lifted some of the bands with it. And then with that came other growing pains that as the bands got bigger, the label was kind of obligated to do the same. So now they need someone who all they do is try to get record stores to carry their records. Another person to be in touch with all the college radio stations around the country. All important work, as you know, like these relationships. But the deeper you go into that, the further you go away from, like, wouldn't it be cool if? And if you're that record label, then your bands start having higher expectations, like getting paid. And that's when, SST was an independent label, but at its peak was operating like like one of the majors. I think at SST's peak, it released more records one year than Warner Brothers.
Wow.
Not sustainable.
No.
For Razorcake, Razorcake was told, well, like, oh, well, you got to get in bookstores, you got to get in record stores, you got to be on newspaper stands. And they were like, okay, well, let's give that a try. But that meant getting in bed with distributors. And some of the distributors, whether they were independent or corporately owned, were a nightmare to deal with, and got to set the terms, because they would be like, okay, we'll take 1,000 copies of your issue. Like, well, wait a second. We only print so many. And then if you take 1,000, can you guarantee that you'll keep them? Like, no, we might send back 999, and by the way, they'll be damaged. So Razorcake decided to stay small. Now I say small, they have a circulation of around 6,000, I think maybe between 5,000 and 7,000. It kind of ebbs and flows, and it's all through subscriptions, all through mail order. There's no distributors. If you see it in a record store, you see it in a barbershop, that's because someone donated money so it could be there for people to pick up for free.
Gotcha.
And then with the hope that some of those people will be like, this is cool, I'm going to subscribe.
Yeah.
and that's the model, and that's what works for Razorcake. Maybe there are some entrepreneurial minds here listening that would be like, oh wow, they should be scaling up. They should be this or that. They could try to do this. What about the web? What about AI? Yeah. Razorcake isn't interested in any of that.
No, and that's, definitely something to share in today's day and age where everything is so focused on progress, right? That progress for progress sake, sometimes even that um, it's it's easy for businesses to like kind of stumble into something that isn't their wheelhouse. Like they think they have to do this because of reasons X, Y, and Z that get brought up to them. So kind of knowing what works best for us and what we should focus on is probably a skill that's kind of gotten lost a little bit over the last definitely the last decade for sure. So
And if you are someone who enjoys making things, whether it's art or records or movies or books or zines, comics, whatever it is, if you like producing things that exist in the world made with paper and things like that, well, you are already an outlier because everything has been for a long time digital and now become moving into this world of not even human produced. I was recently in China for several weeks, and I rode the trains, amazing subway system, amazing infrastructure, and every single train I got on, everyone was on their phone. Students, young people, old people, everybody was on their phone. Now, like, not everyone in the sense that there were some old people taking care of very young people, but as soon as they got old enough or were a little bit younger, they were all looking at screens. And I don't think that's where technology is taking us, and that's where culture is going. So if you have like a thought of like, I'm going to make a zine and I'm going to revolutionize print or revolutionize whatever you're passionate about, the answer is, well, probably not. But you should
Right.
still do it anyway.
right.
Because there are going to be people like you who like the same things you do, care about the same things you do, and are passionate about the same things you do. And a zine might be the only way to get them, or a movie or a comic. I know, really upbeat stuff.
No, but I think that's the important thing, right? Is new isn't always better. Like we're kind of led into that, but sometimes turning the other way is actually where you find where we fit.
Yeah, I did a book with the band Bad Religion and their history, their 40-year history, and I remember very distinctly talking with Jay Bentley about the 90s when digital equipment was coming on board and people were throwing away all the analog stuff. No, it's got to be digital. It's like, well, maybe they should have been hanging on to some of that stuff because the stuff that's still around, as gearheads can attest, is worth a lot of money, and a lot of it sounds better.
Yeah, it's got like a warmer tone to it almost.
Absolutely.
It's definitely more lived in. So,
Absolutely.
Kind of touched on this, but when you're looking at punk culture today, what do you think is one of the most important things to protect and kind of hold on to? Like music progresses and all that, but something from the past that new bands might not fully understand. What do you think are some of these things that like are kind of core to the culture as a whole?
That really isn't a concern of mine. I'm 57 years old.
Yeah.
So I'm maybe the last person you should ask. But if there are other 57 year olds out there, or other elder punks, I would say to be less protective of this thing that has sustained us and nourished us all these years, and let the kids go. Let them cook. If someone wants to plug in a guitar and make some noise, and also use some electronic equipment and other things and call it punk rock, then that's what it is. We don't need to gatekeep or hold on to things, and if it doesn't sound exactly the way we remembered it. I mean, in the 90s, there was so much of that going on in zines, talking about what was punk, what wasn't, especially when, for the first time, people could make money and have a career performing punk, which for the first, 20 years of its existence was not a possibility at all. Um, so, like, yeah, there were a lot of wars in the zines about this, with some zines being very restrictive. I won't name names, but the initials are Maximum Rock and Roll, about what is punk, what is not punk. The Bay Area has always been pretty rigid in that regard.
Yeah.
And Flipside was always a little looser.
Okay, so kind of just going to maybe some of yours, like, it's easy to name drop bands and whatnot, but I'm just kind of curious, as a writer, musician kind of person, who kind of helped shape your understanding of punk, whether it's a writer, philosopher, musician, maybe somebody who did all the above. Is there anybody you'd like to kind of share with, like, that really influenced you?
Well, I mean, two of the early writers that were a big influence in me, especially when I was in the Navy and didn't have any kind of education yet, was On the Road, Jack Kerouac, because it was all about being a seeker.
Yeah.
Which is, my advice for, kind of my approach for new music is always seeking it out. That's what I had to do in the Navy, and I've just never stopped. My favorite band is always a band that I've, embraced in the last, 6 weeks or so. And then in true Gen X fashion, I discard them because the new stuff isn't as good as the old stuff. But I'm still seeking the new stuff.
Good. No, I get it. So
it's a sickness. I can't help it.
It's the new toy. It's great and everything, but after a couple weeks, there's that thing that we love, that we have that history with.
Well, and people are always creating new music. That's one of the great things about writing for a zine, is I get exposed to a lot of it through the magazine. I still have to seek it out. I still have to go listen to it. And as most people know, that there's no substitute for live music, so that's part of it, the experience too.
Getting into kind of storytelling as a whole, because whether it's in book format or in zine format, how do you ever, do you feel responsible for telling these stories to a certain degree? There's like a phrase I've kind of heard before is like, I got to get the story right, and so I'm just wondering, you as a creative person, how do you kind of navigate that? And is it more, you just kind of share from your own experience, and it's okay if it's not exactly what the band or the person might kind of be putting out there, right? Like, there's that different in perspective.
Yeah, that would be a problem. Like when I'm collaborating with another artist, especially one I respect and admire, like Bad Religion, or Keith Morris of the Circle Jerks, first singer for Black Flag. That was the first punk rock project I worked on in book form, and if you know Keith Morris at all, you know that he has a very distinctive voice. No one else sounds like Keith. He's one of one. And working with him was a little nerve-wracking because, one, it's Keith Morris, and two, I better get this right, because if it doesn't sound like Keith, then the whole project is a failure. So yeah, that fidelity to an artist's worldview is extremely important, especially when it's their book. For other projects, I'm always concerned with getting it right. I was really concerned that when I was working on Corporate Rock Sucks, that there were going to be a million Gen X train spotters, not that different from myself, who were going to write in and be like, well, actually, or this is what you got wrong. And I've gotten some of that, like expected, because there were mistakes in the first edition. But for the most part, people were really supportive that, like, wow, I always wanted this book, and you did it. Thank you, is usually the approach from people who are fans, and will look past the mistakes. So I think that desire to get it right is always there, and sometimes it's not factual or even stylistic. It can be. I mean, I also write fiction, and whether I'm writing a short story or a novel, that desire to get the story right, to, I don't want to say honor the intention of when you started because things change,
Yeah.
but to make it worthwhile someone's time and their imagination and emotional investment. Yeah, the desire to get it right is always first and foremost.
So we've kind of talked about the past. We've talked about the present. Let's open it up a little bit here. So let's
We're gonna have a future, Josh. Are you sure about that?
Whether we want to or not, right? Like, time keeps moving forward. So I'm kind of curious, in your own words, your own perspective, just looking at the future, what does the future of punk look like? Is there anything you'd like to see more of? Like you kind of mentioned that, we don't want to gatekeep, we want everyone else to kind of like make their noise and do their own thing. But I'm just kind of curious, as someone who's been around the industry, where you think things are going, where you'd like things to go.
Well, I think the blending of genres is really fascinating. And I think now is the time to do it. A great example of that would be a band from Mexico City called Son Rompopera. They're a cumbia punk band, and just incredible musicians who were all raised in a number of different traditions, but first and foremost cumbia, but yet they're a punk band. Even though if you just see them play, and you couldn't hear them, you'd be like, what is it? What kind of madness is this? This is incredible energy, even though the centerpiece of this band is a xylophone. And, I can hear people saying, well, xylophone's not punk, but like, it is when Son Rompopera play it. Or maybe now when people listening to that band pick it up and try something new. So I'm really fascinated by that. I really enjoy that. And I was really, one of the highlights of last year was working with that band and helping to facilitate an interview with that band on our previous issue in Razorcake, 149. So check that out. I love bands like Kneecap, who maybe, they're a band that raps in Irish. They have a DJ, no guitars, nothing like that in the terms of punk as a musical aesthetic or musical style, but punk as an aesthetic. Because they are confrontational and they're political and they rap in Irish, which just limits the audience in a really fascinating way, and has, been extremely inflammatory. They paid I want to say paid a price because they just speaking their mind, speaking for what they believe is right, which is that Israel has no place in Palestine and that the genocide must come to an end. And that makes a lot of music, promoters and festivals that have all these corporate sponsorships very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That when you stand up for, the most vulnerable people, there'll be a corporation and they'll say you can't do that, whether it's, the people of Gaza, whether it's trans kids, whatever it is. People are like, anything that's not safe, corporations get nervous, and I think that's where punk should live, is making corporations uncomfortable. And so Kneecap has been a band that I follow with interest and hope to get to see someday, because they're just so in your face. And what has happened that no one could have predicted is that now, because of this rap, punk, electronic, whatever you want to call it, band, there's been a resurgence of the Irish language in both the north and south of Ireland.
That's awesome.
Scrappy little band from West Belfast.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of stuff I get really excited about, and otherwise ask the teen punk on your street what you should be listening
That was good advice. Awesome.
to. Ask a punk.
Ask a punk. Go ask a punk. Okay, so you're currently writing for Razorcake here. This is episode or number 150. Does it come out every month?
Comes out every 2 months.
Every 2 months.
6 issues a year.
Uh-huh.
So that means 25 years of punk rock zine. And Razorcake is also a nonprofit, so you can donate to Razorcake and write that off if that's what you do. You can also help sponsor a space. If you like Razorcake, you can donate, and Razorcake will send a bundle of magazines to a bar, a record store, a bookstore, a zine library, wherever you want, they'll do it. And subscriptions are still dirt cheap in this day when it costs $10 to park here, and
Right.
I think, what did this cost? A couple bucks? I don't know. I don't know if you can even buy them individually anymore, because it's all done through mail order.
Right.
I also have another novel coming out, which I can't tell you the details yet, but it's coming out this fall, and it's a crime novel about 4 English professors that go on a crime spree. Since we're at SDSU, I should add the disclaimer that this is a work of fiction that I'm talking about, although crime does pay. And I have another nonfiction book coming out next year
Okay.
that's related to punk rock, but also is kind of something completely new for me. And something new, something old. I think when you find out about it, you'd be like, oh, that tracks. That makes sense that I would be writing about that. And so I have these things I can't tell you about, but if you want to find out for yourself, I have a weekly Substack that comes out every Wednesday called Message from the Underworld, named after a excellent song by Weirdos.
Yeah.
And it's free to subscribe.
Awesome. Website, how do we actually, what is people going to look up? Because it's the Message from the Underground. That's not the URL you type in, right? That's
on Substack. I think it is. But
Okay.
yeah, Jim Ruland Message from the Underworld will take you
Okay.
right there. I have a website.
Yeah.
Maybe I updated it this year. It was, websites are kind of 2005, but you got to have them, right? So I think right now Substack is where it's at. Maybe
Okay.
we'll laugh at this in 10 years and be like, oh, you silly fool. We're now on Zoodle
There you go. Awesome.
or McWeebs.
All right. Jim, thank you very much for coming, hanging out with us today.
Thank you, Josh.
No, I appreciate it. You've been able to share quite a bit. For everyone watching, read zines, go out, get involved in your community. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.